Well, good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, depending upon where you are in the world, and welcome to today's DevOps.com webinar. I'm Charlene O'Hanlon, moderator for today's event, and I welcome you. As always, we have a great event on tap. I'm particularly excited about this one. But before we get started, we do have a few housekeeping items we need to go over. First of all, today's event is being recorded, so if you miss any or all of the event, you will have the opportunity to access it later on. Following today's webinar, we will be sending out an email that contains a link to access the webinar on demand. And we are taking questions from the audience. So if at any time during today's presentation you have a question for either of our speakers, please don't wait, don't hesitate. Just use your GoToWebinar control panel and submit your questions, and we will try to get to as many as we can near the end of today's webinar. Also happening at the end of today's webinar, we will be doing a drawing for 4 $25 Amazon gift cards. So please stick around. Hopefully you'll be one of our 4 lucky winners. All right, with that, let's go ahead and kick off today's webinar, which is Open Source Governance, Top 10 Trends and Predictions for 2021. Our speakers today are Alex Ryback, who is the Director of Product Management at Revenera, and Russ Ealing, who is the founder and CEO of OSS Engineering Consultants. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm super excited to have you here.
Thank you, Charlene. Appreciate it.
Great. All right, well, Alex, I know you're going to be kicking us off. I'm going to take myself off camera and put myself on mute and let you get right to your presentation.
All right, thank you so much. So thank you everybody for joining. Happy New Year to everybody. Hope it's still appropriate to do that part. Okay, so we got a good topic on tap today. It's one of my favorite webinars in the year. So today we're going to look at the top 10 trends heading into 2021, talk a little bit about what we see behind the trends, why they're occurring, and make some predictions, look into our crystal ball, make some predictions for what we think will happen during the year. So as Charlene mentioned, I'm Alex Ryback. I'm a Director of Product Management at Revenera, focusing on our software composition analysis products. And with me, I've got Russ Ealing, who is a founder at OSS Engineering Consultants. So I work on building SCA products for our customers. Russ is a partner and a customer, and he is the person who deploys, uses the products, and helps his customers in the field setting up processes to support the product and open source governance programs. So you get the benefit of both perspectives on each of these trends. I will cover more of the trend itself and why it's happening, and then Russ will provide his commentary based on his experience of how it may relate to you, some tips, and hopefully you'll learn a few things along the way. So let's get going. Okay, so trend number 1, shift left movement. So this should be no surprise to anybody. This is something that has been around for a few years. SCA is really kind of starting to catch on with this trend. So anytime we talk about shift left, what we're really talking about is discovering issues early and often and fixing things in course with the discovery earlier in the process, and thereby saving complexity, saving time, and ultimately saving money. It is much more expensive to fix an issue in software once it's released or as it's getting close to release, and much more cost effective and much simpler to do it as soon as it's discovered. So the shift left movement is all about doing things earlier on in the development process to be able to uncover issues when they do not become stagnant, when people are still around that may have introduced them, and when they are easier to fix. So for SCA, why does this matter? So teams are under increasing pressure to release software faster than ever. Time to market is a critical factor. Everybody's racing. Everybody's managers are under pressure to get their teams to deliver quickly. So if you have an SCA process that is manual, that relies on lots of human effort, that isn't integrated into engineering tools, you are likely to either slow things down or just miss a cycle, right? And missing a cycle can be critical. We've seen this with vulnerability exposures in the past. So it's really important to be on top of your SCA practices. I always like to think of SCA as another automated test cycle, right? We're looking for composition, we're looking for compliance issues. Other test tools look for code quality problems. And the process is very similar. So anything you might invest in from just overall product quality and application security perspective, you certainly want to apply the same principles to SCA. The other thing to consider, given what we just went through in 2020, we've got a highly distributed workforce. There's team members spread around the country, are not physically in offices in most cases. So whereas before you may be able to run over to your coworker's cube and let them know that they forgot to do something, all of those types of conversations have become much more complex virtually. So it is always good to have a process that is in place, that's automated, and is plugged into a continuous process and continuous system. The other real thing to understand is throughout 2020, developers have been more and more put into the front lines of application security. They are the ones who must first ensure that products are coded properly, run various test tools, run composition tools. So they're the ones on the front lines, they're the ones that are first exposed, and making sure that the needs that they have to not slow them down from their main job of writing code and releasing great products. You want integrations into the tools they use. You want it to be as frictionless as possible, and you want to make sure that it's plugged into something that is familiar to them, right? You don't want to take them away from their main task of developing applications. So what do we think is going to happen in 21? So first of all, we certainly don't think that the office population will return to the same levels as it was in 2019. There's going to be a lot of employees that enjoyed working from home, will probably come back to more of a hybrid work environment. So there will still be a distributed nature to the relationships at work, and therefore, again, an automated process is critical. We also think that the definition of shift left will evolve. There will be more expected functionality. All right, today maybe scan invocation, maybe quick compliance checks are kind of all that's really demanded. We do see this evolving over time. The expectation for the level of depth of scanning and analysis will increase, and the level of capabilities that developers are offered as part of the shift left movement will certainly go up. And we really see all of this beginning to crystallize in 21. So Russ, did you want to share any kind of real experiences from having to deploy this at customer sites?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Alex. So, I mean, shifting left is a great concept when it comes to open source governance, but really you need to do it the right way and as part of a larger governance initiative. So shifting left needs to go beyond just saying we're shifting left. So in open source, similar to finding a bug in your software, the earlier you find it and deal with it, the less costly and impactful it's going to be on your program. So there's a lot of ways to accomplish this, and certainly you can't expect to just flip a switch and find that all of a sudden you've shifted left. One somewhat manual approach to this could involve the developer doing a quick compliance check during component selection. You could have an open source person or team that reviews open source usage early in the process, and then perhaps again closer to the final release. Automation during build is also possible with your SCA tool and your CI pipeline. Consistency can be a challenge for organizations that have large product families. Often you'll find different SDLCs, different pipelines, different distributions like cloud or on-prem, server, etc. They could be across large product families. And so by shifting left, you enable your developers to be part of your frontline on open source governance. You can make scanning, identification, compliance, governance, all part of the culture. So going back to what I started with, shifting left needs to be part of the larger governance initiative. It's a great place to start, but on its own, it's not usually enough.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, and the key thing I would bring up is it is very much a culture shift. You can't just expect folks that aren't trained in the practices to adopt it. So it's more than just tooling. It requires people to think differently and think much more incrementally and in smaller pieces and continuously. Okay, so moving on, number 2, so software supply chain maturity. So in 2020, we saw lots of industry groups that all kind of had a common goal, right? They all want greater transparency and trust from software vendors with respect to application security. There's various logos you see here, right, coming from different perspectives around human health and safety, around information technology, and privacy, financial, and so forth. But they all have a common goal, is they want people to understand the chain of custody of software. They want people to understand what is in the software that they release downstream through the software supply chain. And they want people who take software in to have disclosures, to have some assurances, to have trust in the process. and to understand any liability they may be incurring along the way and be able to patch issues as they're found. We also see certainly the number of breaches are increasing, the volume and sophistication of the breaches are increasing. So it's really critical to have a process in place to catch vulnerabilities early and often. The other thing we saw in late 2020 is OpenChain obtained ISO certification, so it is now known as ISO 5230. It is basically a set of guidelines and best practices for how to properly manage an open source process in your organization, and how to certify that your results are trustworthy, and how to share information throughout the software supply chain. So 21, few things that we're thinking. Number one, if you look at ISO 27001, it is kind of the de facto standard for managing security and information assets. So now the OpenChain ISO certification really expands that to include externally sourced software assets. So now you have a full kind of asset portfolio view of all of the things that may contain security vulnerabilities or licensing issues that may reach your customers, and they need to trust you that you have a handle on the process. We also foresee that given that the OpenChain specification is now a standard, it's going to be much easier and much more frequently incorporated into software contracts. So we did see back in 2019 and 20, 10%, maybe up to 20% of the contracts we engage with our customers, people directly ask, explain your open source program, provide disclosures, provide assurances, provide trustworthiness into the material that you convey to us. And we do expect that to increase and eventually just become a standard clause in software contracts where you just won't be able to do business if you can't provide some set of assurances on what is in the code that you ship. The other thing we really see in 21 is a lot more collaboration inside the organization. There's a much bigger burden on developers to be on the front line, as we mentioned before. There's a lot more stakeholders that are interested in the software bill of material. So there needs to be a lot more communication and less silos between legal teams, security teams, export teams, and others that require knowledge about the open source assets in the products that your organization's built. Russ, what's your take on the software supply chain?
So I think it's something that needs to be done continuously, regardless of whether or not you've shifted left. It can't, or at least it shouldn't be something that you do once or even once in a while and then call it good, unless there's a scenario where you have one product and only one release. But that said, you can absolutely take a phased approach to doing this, and there's a lot of ways to accomplish that. Depending on your organization and your product portfolio, I might go after a couple of products or services first, but get it done well. So that's like going deep on a select few, maybe your riskiest products or services. Another approach is to go wide and try to cover the entire portfolio, but perhaps at a higher level with less granularity, and then go deeper over time. One caveat relative to this topic is organizations that have longer product cycles or legacy code that's been in use for some time, you should be active contributors or supporters in the ecosystem that you're taking from. You don't want to have an open source project that's critical to you become abandoned or no longer supported.
Yep, and that's a critical point. So if you're building planes, building cars, anything that's going to be in service for a long time, you're critically reliant on the ecosystems that deliver the open source that you leverage. So certainly want to contribute as much as you consume from there. Okay, number 3, training, right? And this is really important because we've now had 2 trends where we see developers on the front lines of kind of this initiative. But if you look at Forrester research from a couple years back, if you look at the top computer science programs, both domestically in the US and the top 5 internationally, they just simply don't include open source licensing and security coding in their curriculum. So this is very much a burden that industry has to carry. Hopefully organizations are mature enough to recognize this, and as they onboard developers onto their teams, even if they move across projects internally, that they are refreshed on your company's open source policies, on security best practices, on what your CISOs believe are the greatest risk for your customers. And this is a kind of an ongoing continuous program. It needs to essentially be akin to what you would do for anti-harassment HR training, right? It needs to be training that is refreshed periodically. There needs to be hopefully some sort of quiz to make sure that people understand it, or at least an acknowledgement that the information has been delivered and acknowledged by the receiver. But unfortunately today, again, the industry bears the burden on this, and it becomes really critical. You can't expect your developers to build secure code if you, number one, don't make them accountable for it, but number two, don't set them up to succeed in doing so. So if you look kind of going forward, hopefully programs will start adopting this. I do know that there's lots of folks in the open source community that do deliver lectures, do guest lectures in universities. Certainly, I'm from California, where I live. That is a practice we see a lot. We'll see a lot of industry folks lecturing as part of programs as guest speakers. So hopefully that continues. But organizations need to at least be prepared to deliver this content to their own employees, absent it coming from academia. There's also needs to be thoughts around what type of security training is necessary. Again, with a distributed workforce, the nature of vulnerabilities and attack vectors is a little different now. So a lot of people with laptops at home, right, not sitting in the confines of your physical location at work. So the nature of security attacks is a little different than in the past. The circle that needs to be protected is much bigger, much broader. Folks sit, working at Starbucks or their coffee shops. So there's a lot more attack vectors today than the days when everybody sat in a single office and everything was protected by physical walls there. So that also needs to be top of mind, depending on the types of applications that your company builds and the nature of use of those applications by your customers. Okay, Russ, over to you.
So I find that having a centralized team allows you to have a little more control and then deeper knowledge to get it right. A concern of mine is that organizations often expect their developers to be the only open source compliance experts. So I think, leave this to a dedicated person or a small team that are experts in open source. Let the developers go develop software. So I've often developed training and trained people and companies to become experts in this area so that it really frees up developers by taking this task off of their plates. And it's a heavy lift, or it can be. And again, you can't expect all of your developers to be experts in open source compliance. In other cases, people have hired me to be that short-term resource to get them going in the right direction until they can either develop or hire a longer-term resource for this kind of role.
Yeah, and I think if you kind of go back to the shift left movement, right, these two correlate, right? You can't, shift left is great and it's absolutely essential to find things early, but it can't be the only thing you do. Much like if all you're doing is relying on your developers' best practices for your security compliance program, that's really not enough, right? You've got to have multiple layers of security, multiple gates, and kind of as you go deeper, more and more sophistication and experience to make sure that you're truly catching all these issues. Okay, so moving along, number 4. So the next couple are around the BOM. So BOM is your bill of material. It represents the assets, either open source, third party, commercial, inside your applications that you build and deliver to your customers. And we've been doing this exercise since I started back in 2006, but here we're reporting back the last 8 years of data or so. But what we do is towards the end of each year, so at Revenera, we have an audit services team who goes and conducts hundreds of audits every year on behalf of our customers. So they will scan the code, they will review the results, and they will prepare a report that goes back to our customers. In some cases, our customers will do this directly themselves. So what we do is every year we go back and grab the last 20 or so audits that we've done. We kind of throw out the outliers, right? So the big and small ones, and we average out the middle audits. And the number that we really track as kind of a critical one is just what is the overall count in a typical audit report. And you can see here we've kind of had 3 levels of changes here. So if you look back to 2012 and through 2014, we're kind of sitting around mid-200s. And that was at that time seen as a monstrous code base, right? A ton of items, 250 things to deal with. It was getting to a point where it was starting to become beyond able to be managed in a spreadsheet. And between 2014 and 16, package managers really became kind of the de facto standard on how you manage third-party content in your application. You define what your dependencies are. Those dependencies then have a long tail of transitive dependencies. When you do the build, all these external assets come in and you build your application. So between 2014 to 2016, we saw a little bit over a doubling of the number of items that we typically produce in a report. So it went from mid 200s to mid 500s. And then it was relatively flat for the next 3 years or so. If you look 2019 to 2020, we're up 442%. So we have seen an average of under 1,000 to now approaching 4,000, right? 3,630 on average. And it's pretty consistent across them, right? There aren't a couple monster audits that dominate. These are pretty consistent numbers in a typical audit report. So what's happened? So if you look at between 2019 and 20, ecosystems such as PyPy for Python, NPM for Node and JavaScript, Ruby gems have become extremely popular. And these are heavily modular open source software where there are lots of very small fragments that are all consumed in a dependency tree that ultimately roll up into your application. So you have a dependency on, say, Angular, and then Angular will bring in hundreds of its own dependencies that then have their own dependencies. So before you know it, you may have 15, 20 dependencies, but you've brought in 500 components from various pieces of code that are now part of your product. So this certainly makes it beyond anything that you can manually address, right? The other thing to note is most companies today, if they are frequent releasers of software, right, if they don't have quarter or annual release cycles, but they release continuously, they build cloud applications, they're typically just going to go to the head of tree and grab the latest version of whatever third-party package there is. So these dependencies have a very high churn rate. Every build, you may be grabbing a new version of a particular JavaScript library. So it's critically important to have SCA infused into your build and being able to notify you if suddenly you have upgraded a component, one of the 3630, and that component has a vulnerability or maybe has a licensing change because licenses were changed year over year. So this is something I would certainly see this growing into 21. We certainly see that the complexity of applications that we look at are much higher. Very non-homogeneous, lots of programming languages pulled together, the back end, the front end, totally different technologies, lots of cloud technology, lots of AI components in the Python world. So definitely see a huge growth in these popular ecosystems and certainly expect the BOM to grow even more into 21 and beyond. All right, so what do we need to focus on? More automation. Being able to keep up with new repositories as they come online, new technologies, new programming languages. Also, we definitely see that the expectation will be that the line for automation is going to be pushed down. Just being able to discover and disclose packages is not enough. You need to get down to code fragments, need to get down to partial sets of files from a repository, for example, or from a component. And there's going to be a much greater demand for depth and automation than there has been in past years. So Russ, you want to talk about what you've seen out there?
Yeah, sure. So I mean, really, it should come as no surprise that SCA tools are an essential component of any open source governance program. As you mentioned earlier, and I think just about everyone would agree that using Excel isn't really a good long-term solution for managing your open source inventory. Imagine trying to track all your dependencies, given the number you described earlier, Alex, on a long-term basis using Excel. You'd run out of tabs, I think, pretty quickly. But don't get me wrong, any start's a good start, even if that means you start out with an Excel document to identify your starting inventory of open source while you work towards a longer-term vision, strategy, and solution. Ideally, you want to build an accurate inventory of your open source using an SCA tool. This will give you the clearest picture of what's there, and it'll help you determine what your actual usage and risks are. And if you're not in a place to move in that direction of acquiring your own SCA instance, you can always outsource the scanning function. I perform and have performed this function on short-term basis for several companies, especially prior to software release. But an important takeaway, I think, here is that you can't comply with and secure what you don't know is there. This is known as unknown unknowns, and they generally represent your highest risk as well as some of your most valuable opportunities to address.
Okay, very good. So kind of building on top of sheer volume in the typical bill of material, right? Let's talk about the importance of the bill of material. So there's a great quote here by Christine from BlackBerry that really talks about the fact that there are lots of folks in her organization that are keenly interested in the bill of material. So if you unwind a few years back, this was typically something that was demanded by legal, right? The bill of material expressed your license obligations and your license risks to the legal department, and they're the ones who were interested in this information. Then came in security, right? Security suddenly realized that if you're running SAST and DAST tools and you're doing pen testing, you're not really looking at open source. You've got a blind spot there. So SCA became kind of the way that you fill that blind spot in open source with security information. So those were kind of the two big constituencies. There was the legal department and your CISO or security team that needed to understand what is the open source exposure, just to make sure that all software assets are being covered. Today, it is not uncommon for export teams to be interested, because if they have to obtain ECCN certification or file for exemptions, they need to disclose all of the encryption that is available in applications that they ship or distribute or host. And if you don't know what crypto capabilities are coming from your open source packages that you're using, you can't be complete in your disclosures. If you look at safety teams, right, anybody who's building anything that can harm or kill somebody, you know, cars and healthcare devices, planes, all of those have very strict security standards, strict safety standards that just cannot be satisfied having a blind spot to your open source exposures. And then chain of custody really becomes a critical element to all this, right? You need to have a secure chain of custody. You need to be able to demonstrate that the code has been monitored all the way through the software supply chain, that everyone who's touched it and modified it in any way has now annotated the bill of material with the modifications, with whatever they may have upgraded or replaced, and that this information ultimately reaches the end consumer of the bill of material. So what do we see looking forward? We certainly see a maturing of internal processes. So in the past, what typically happened was the compliance team would do the work. They would put together a bill of material, and then maybe they would send a report over to the security team, kind of as an FYI, as external data that says, by the way, here's a list of our open source. Today, we're seeing lots of companies trying to unify that process, where the security teams are doing their scanning, compliance teams are doing their scanning, developers are doing their scanning as part of Shift Left. And what people want is a unified bill of material across the system, across the organization. Ideally, one that could be filtered to an application top-down view, or one that can be interrogated bottom-up. If there's a new vulnerability, where are we exposed? Can we light it up, in the list of all applications? Where do we have a vulnerability? Where do we have a particularly troublesome license? Are there components that are under active litigation? Are there things that are no longer actively maintained? So anything that is deemed a risk to your organization, you need the bill of material, you need it to be up to date, you need it to alert you and to be monitored if there's changes, so that you can react with quality data and be able to make fixes and deliver them to the field. And that's the other kind of thing we see in 21 is a lot more push on capabilities to assess impact and how widespread it may be in your organization. So if a new vulnerability occurs and it becomes a headline in the news, where do we have it? Do we use this component? Where do we use it? How do we use it? Which teams need to patch? And can we get that patch into the hands of our customers as quickly as possible? Saras, so what are you seeing around the importance of the BOM?
Yeah, so I mean, this slide really ties together the last two slides, because you have the importance of the BOM that depends on the right people to generate that BOM. So think of how important this task could be. This could be a request from a customer of yours for a security incident, for export controls, as Alex mentioned, a lawsuit, or any compliance event that could be external to your company. But for any of these scenarios, you want your BOM to be trustworthy. So yes, it can be done in silos and in pockets within your company, but to be best in class, you really should consider centralizing your experts, which can still mean a team of one if you are in a large company, or perhaps you're otherwise resource constrained.
Okay, great. All right, so moving on to the bottom half. So number 6, maturity and consolidation of OSS marketplaces. So we see two things. We see GitHub continuously getting bigger. We also see boutique repositories popping up on a weekly basis. So there's kind of two things, I guess, that come to mind. So, Microsoft acquired GitHub back in 2018, which was a big thing because you had a commercial company, right, acquire an open source ecosystem, and it has grown tremendously since then, right? Just looking in last year, 60 million new repositories, close to 2 billion contributions. That is all code that, unless you are paying attention, is in some way making its way into your proprietary code base. So if you are not cataloging, if you're not keeping your BOM up to date, if you are not controlling where your developers are going out and grabbing content, you have 2 billion contributions that are out there and available. And you need to have some sort of process to gate this, to control it, to at least catalog it, and to know where to go to obtain a fix if there is an issue discovered. If you look at another interesting trend, which is if you go look at the popular repositories, so PyPy or Ruby Gems or Maven or Apache, you will see that all of them ultimately point back to GitHub for most of the storage of the source code behind the packages that are being delivered through all of these different places. So if you have a build and you have a typical modern application, you may have, a Java backend, you may have a, PHP front end, you may have, Python backend, and so forth. But the point is, you're going to have different technologies that are being sourced from different repositories, and you have the packages coming to you from whatever package manager you may be using as part of your build. But you have the source that's being modified, that's building these packages sitting on GitHub. So you've got a long chain of custody, and you've got multiple external data points that ultimately bring content into your application. So what we really see here is we see there's a lot of new smaller repositories popping up. They're maturing, they're getting popular, and then in some cases they're being gobbled up by larger ones. So GitHub, for example, acquired NPM earlier in 2020. So now we see the most popular JavaScript repository along with the most popular source code repository sitting, all owned by Microsoft, and all sitting there with a mass collection of files, right? So understanding kind of where you're sourcing your code, who's in control of it, is this a location you're comfortable with, is it not one you're comfortable with, can only be determined if you understand all the dependencies that you have in your applications. So where do we see this going? Certainly there will be new repositories that pop up. Lots of companies build their own repositories. They don't want to open up their engineering teams to anything out in the internet, so they will curate components that they're comfortable with, either in private repositories. In some cases, there may be public ones for others to use as well. We do see potential of some consolidation of smaller players into larger ones, although that's typically a longer term play, a longer term trend. But there's certainly a need to organize better. Right? There's so much redundant code out there that's being sourced in multiple places that it's really important to understand where do your teams source it from. Can you control the number of places a developer is able to pull in an Apache package, for example? Do you want to control it? Do you want to set up an internal kind of vetted repository so that anything coming into the company gets reviewed, gets approved, and only from there the development teams will pull into their products? Right? So these are all things to consider, and it's all going to be commensurate with a level of risk that you want to carry as an organization, and certainly can vary by business unit, by product team inside a large organization. So how do you see this playing out for your customers?
Yeah, I'll just make a brief comment here, Alex. So, I mean, I really try to not tell developers what code they should use and where they should get it from. I do try to inform them on best practices, regardless of where they're getting the code from. So some just high-level examples are to make sure there's a license in the package you're downloading, or perhaps noting a URL to the source of the package. Or if you're leveraging ideas or elements of code, you can make notes of where it came from so that your open source team could easily track down the license and also the context for how it was used.
Yep, and I'll just bring up one more point. I mean, this came up as recently this morning on a customer call I was on. Is let's say your customer, let's say you inbound a piece of open source, and let's say you discover a vulnerability, and for whatever reason you can't wait for a fix, or you want to fix it yourself. Well, so how do you inform your developers that you now have a patched version that you feel is of higher quality than the one they can go out and get from the internet, right? So there's definitely knowledge necessary to understand the chain of custody and the provenance of the open source that's in your code, and to steer developers into where you're comfortable, either internally or externally, and understand the risks that come with it. Okay, so the next couple are all about kind of M&As and analysis, right? So about a year ago, right, when we went into 2020 and when COVID started, right? So M&A slowed down tremendously, right? The markets kind of came to a halt. The activity slowed down in the market, and throughout 2020 we saw it pick up again. There were several very large transactions in the second half of 2020. From our own audit practice, we definitely see M&A picking up again. Lots of companies took this as an opportunity, right, in the spirit of don't waste the crisis, and kind of geared up and improved to be able to take advantage of some deals that are out there. So M&A is certainly back. We have a quote here from Deloitte, which talks about that 61% of deal makers do expect it to return back to pre-COVID levels within a year or so. So we're seeing this certainly in our audit practice. But the one thing that we do see is the nature of what people are after and the time that they are willing to wait for results to come in is definitely changing. We are seeing more interest in overviews, in targeted analysis, in phased results. So yes, we realize we need to take 3 weeks to go through all the code, but we'd like a report out in 5 days of the most egregious issues that were discovered. Right, so people are looking for quicker responses, quicker turnaround, and higher level results earlier in the process. Going forward, we certainly expect volume to pick up as there's more known, about the vaccine and the impact and whether we're making a dent in returning back to work and back to business as usual. As there's less risk in the markets, M&A activity will certainly increase. So we definitely expect the volume to go up over time. The other thing we see, and we do expect it to be a bigger trend, is we are actually seeing M&A underwriters are starting to try to mitigate their own risk by putting in their own clauses into insurance contracts. So they are actually asking questions from their customers, so the company being acquired or the company acquiring. Do you have an open source regular management practice? How do you go about determining bill of materials? How do you vet the code that's coming in from an M&A activity? Does that increase the risk exposure of your company? So this is not only something that's in the mind of customers, it's also in the mind of underwriters as they are underwriting these tech M&As to make sure that there is proper disclosures and that there is a common understanding of what is the code that's being bought and what is the downstream effects of incorporating that into the acquirer's code base and onto their customers. So Russ, do you have any thoughts on this one?
Just maybe a brief thought. I mean, you covered a lot of it there, Alex. So specifically for M&A, this is probably something you don't want to be doing yourselves. So you can engage with external services on this. I would pick a vendor that's outside your organization and that can meet your needs. Some things to consider would be the time to set up and then deliver, also the depth or accuracy of the audit, and then of course the cost of the service. So there's large companies like Revenera that have entire departments dedicated to this activity that can do this for you, as well as independents such as myself that have the tools and capabilities as well.
Okay, great. And then number 8 is kind of a piggybacking off the previous one, right? This is a little more general to audits, but what we are seeing is we are seeing more and more timelines getting compressed. We see, value stream management being really important. So flow becomes important, focusing on only tasks that ultimately lead to customer value. And at the end of the day, people simply just don't have the patience to wait for days, weeks to get through every single line of code. So as I mentioned in the previous point, kind of relates here as well, is people expect faster turnaround. People seem to be more willing to sacrifice depth and completeness for faster delivery, but you got to be very mindful of the fact that if you do that, you are certainly increasing your risk exposure, right? If you're not looking for anything beyond packages, then kind of to Russ's point, you have the unknown of the unknown. So it's not something that's for everybody. Not everybody needs to look at every single line of code, but it needs to be commensurate with the culture of your organization. If you have a very risk-averse legal or security organization, you need to apply the same principles and the same requirements to analysis of the code that's either coming to you from an M&A, from perhaps offshore development, from a partner, or even in-house from your own development of proprietary code. So just kind of be mindful of that, that every time corners are cut or any time that analysis is reduced, or you're looking more for an overview or targeted versus a full forensic analysis, that is what you're giving up, is resolution and insight into things that may be copy-paste events, maybe, again, kind of partial files from a package being pulled in. These are all things that have been known to bring in unexpected licensing conundrums, as well as potentially vulnerabilities from code that hasn't been analyzed or scanned. So just kind of a heads up on that. So we certainly see this trend continuing. Obviously, people want things faster, more automation. We do see more of a need in SCA products around hotspot analysis. Having gone kind of quickly through all the code in an organization, can we identify through heuristics where additional cycles are needed? Can that be configurable? Can I tell you that in this organization, it's a hosted product, so we're more focused on security. In another organization, maybe distributed, so licensing is as important as security. And can that show us where we want to put people for more cycles, more analysis, maybe come back for a second phase and look deeper, right? So phased analysis and just understanding along the way the trade-offs that you are making if you're trying to move faster with less controls. Russ, any comments on this?
Yeah, so I mean, just exactly to your point, everyone wants to get results faster. So I would encourage leaders, take a step back and consider the goals and the culture of your organization while you're considering the goals of faster delivery for your dev teams. So what does this look like? There is this inverse correlation between scanning speed and depth of scanning, as Alex mentioned. And therefore also audit, which can impact how long it can take to generate an accurate BOM. So you could choose a solution that caters specifically to build integration and speed, but then it sacrifices depth and accuracy in order to obtain that speed. Some can go deep on scanning, but they're not especially fast, or perhaps they don't integrate very well. Regardless, I mean, make sure that your tooling solution either meets your needs or at least allows you to adjust the controls, so to speak, allowing you the flexibility to go higher level and fast at first, but also allow you to go deeper as needs change. So for leaders, I mean, you need to figure out what's your own risk again and your culture to make sure you're doing enough to satisfy your internal needs as well as those of your customers. It can be a delicate balance, and certainly it varies from company to company. But for anybody out there, I mean, shoot me an email if you're stuck or if you just need a little help to get you moving in the right direction. I'd be happy to help.
Okay, great. So to close out, we got two more themes or two more trends, and they are really around market challenges. Right, so the first one, so market challenge around content. And this is a really big deal because the volume of available code in the open source universe is just growing beyond the level where everything can be collected, right? So there's really two things that are kind of at odds with each other. One is the false positive rate in results, and the other one is data currency and just keeping up. So if you look at our collection, and we've been collecting content since 2003, in the last 18 months, we have essentially doubled our collection. So that means in the last 18 months, there has been more material put out there than in the last 10 years plus combined, which is a pretty staggering stat. So collecting everything, number one, is just not feasible, and number two, just doesn't make sense. All right, so what we are faced with essentially is, number one, from a false positive perspective, if you want to look deeper, if you want to sift through every single line of code, if you want to look at all of your source code and all of the images and icons and libraries that are coming in, there's going to be some level of noise. So we need to build features, and we need to continue to improve features in the product around filtering, around prioritizing, around setting thresholds. So the scanner or the view that you're looking at is only showing you the most relevant stuff depending on what matters to you, that it is informed by past use, informed by correlation to other results, right? So we're not just dumping thousands and thousands of results, but instead you're really focusing on what is relevant in the context of the task that you're trying to perform. On the data currency side, we really shift into a different paradigm. Collecting everything just in case is just not feasible anymore. So we're looking at, number one, can we start shifting more to real-time lookups, right? As opposed to pre-collecting and putting things into a library, Maybe the better approach, in fact, one thing we're working on, is can we do more real-time lookups, right? Can we let you query things so that we're never behind, there is no lag, and make sure that we're supporting that for customers picking the things that they want to select as part of their bill of materials. The second thing is putting in advanced filtering criteria. So collecting the most relevant content. Not every release that's put up on GitHub ever gets pushed out, right? It could be an interim continuous build, and there could be 20 of them during a day or hundreds of them during the day. All of that code typically does not get released. There are certain levels or quality of releases that go out the door. So it's important to understand that and really focus collection efforts on the most relevant content and on code that is most likely to be used, to be distributed, to be shared, and to be put out there for consumption by customers. Russ, any comments on this?
Yeah, I think as we talked on the previous slide, you need to understand or at least consider the risk profile and the culture of your companies. Perhaps you don't need to examine every line of code like we mentioned earlier in the presentation, depending on what open source you're using, and then equally important, how you are using it. So it's definitely worth looking into. Certainly don't make assumptions here. Regardless of your approach, this doesn't need to be instant or an all or nothing way of looking at it. You heard me earlier talking about the phased approach, and I think this is an ideal way to both make progress as well as allowing you time to figure out what works best for your company, your culture, and your risk profile.
Okay, and then finally, the second challenge and probably the most difficult piece is deployment challenge, right? So, and it's really splits into two parts. Number one is enterprise scaling, just the fact that we've kind of gotten to a point where if you look at SCA sales, they're pretty much done educating prospects. People get it. People understand this is important. People understand they have to have a handle on open source exposures, vulnerabilities, in some cases licensing. So I think people get the problem. The challenge now is how do I fit it in? How do I not disrupt my team with what they've grown accustomed to doing? How does this fit into the processes that we've invested in? How is this not any particular person's job, but everybody's job, right? Everybody's responsible to help out, even if you do have a dedicated team for this. How do we keep up with customers that are maturing, have greater need for the product, do thousands of scans a day, have a complete continuous deployment where the scanner is always burdened with scanning, right? So those are the kind of the enterprise scaling challenges. If you look at deployment models, the deployment models are definitely shifting, right? We've moved from I have a server under my desk, I'm sitting in a room with nobody knows what I'm doing here. I'm looking at our customer code and I'm kind of like the FBI of source code auditing, to I want to be in the cloud. I want an ephemeral deployment, right? I don't want to tie down hardware that's dedicated to this process. I want this to be elastic. I want the SCA to be an element of my virtual build that spins up, spins down, extends where more capacity is required, and then gives resources back so they can be consumed for other processes. So that's the challenge we're facing. This is starting to become a big ask in 2020. I certainly expect this to be even more of an ask in 21. Certainly people don't want to spend time on IT supports of systems, right? So being able to have some cloud capabilities, although not everybody's comfortable uploading the code for cloud scanning, but there's certainly elements of SCA that can be done in the cloud safely. And then ultimately, even if you are still keeping this process in-house, having more elastic deployments, right? Being able to extend where you need to, contract when you don't need those resources, and being able to kind of manage your competing pool, both from a cost perspective, as well as for capacity where there's a greater need for scan horsepower, right, to be able to get through large projects. So Russ, off to you for some final comments here.
Yeah, thanks. So enterprise scaling really, it can be challenging, but having done this at large companies, I could tell you that the centralized approach that I described earlier, it works with the scenario that Alex just described. So there's a place in the process for an open source specialist to go deep while also not slowing down development, and then most importantly, not slowing down deployment. So this essentially comes down to training, tooling, efficient processes, and good integration within the enterprise, which includes support from the top of the company. So having someone help you through this who's done it before can certainly be helpful and is generally more efficient than trying to take it on yourself. But that said, I mean, with the right considerations, tooling, and support, there's really nothing stopping you from achieving this.
Okay, great. So let's do a quick summary and then we're happy to take questions. So went through 10 key trends that we see and given our thoughts for what we think is going to happen this year. So start off with adoption of shift left. Then software supply chain maturity, right? That really go hand in hand because you need a continuous process where people understand their roles, responsibilities, understand why they're doing it, what they're expected to do, and can bring others into an established process. Then moved on to training for both licensing and security topics. Then talked about the BOM, the fact that it continues to grow and there's been a significant jump between 2019 and 2020. The emphasis on the importance of the BOM. There's just a lot more stakeholders that have a keen interest, and the BOM is a common denominator between lots of their compliance programs and a piece of data that they need to be able to manage their programs. Then switched over to talk about open source marketplaces, right? The fact that there's new ones spawning all the time. There's some large players that continue to grow, and we do potentially see some consolidation there. Talked about M&A, the fact that it is definitely coming back, that we do think it's going to come back to levels of 2019, and making sure that if your company is planning to acquire technology, that it goes through the proper due diligence process. And if you are hoping to be acquired, that you have your house in order and you are ready to be acquired. Analysis timelines getting compressed, right? So how do you do more in less time with less cost and still only accrue an acceptable level of risk into your organization? And then we closed off with 2 market challenges around content, so false positives and data currency, and around deployment models and enterprise scaling. So again, thank you for joining. Hope this was interesting to the attendees, and we're happy to take some questions.
All right, great. We have about 5 or 6 minutes for some questions. So why don't we go ahead and dive right on in here. Here's a question for you. What are the open source tools or open source data repositories available to track open source libraries and dependencies in terms of licensing, vulnerabilities, and recommended library updates?
So I'm certainly biased in my answer, so I'll let Russ go first here.
No, I mean, I don't know. I think it's a good one for you, Alex, actually.
Yeah, well, I mean, so obviously, you know, we at Revenair have a product called Code Insight. That's exactly what it's designed to do. Can be run by teams that are experts in doing deep dive analysis and audits, can also be deployed as plugins as part of your build. It is designed to do exactly what is stated in the question, is identify the open source that you rely on, identify both direct and transitive dependencies that open source relies on, identify open source obligations that you have, vulnerabilities you're exposed to, and allow you to review or remediate this, integrate with other engineering tools, and run a compliance program backed by the product. So ours is certainly one of them. There's other scanning tools out there available. Russ, I don't know if you want to weigh in on top of that.
Yeah, I mean, there's no, and I tell companies this all the time, there's no single cookie cutter approach to doing any of this. Again, and I'll go back to what we said earlier in the slides. You have to do what fits best for your culture, your organization, and then certainly you've got your resource allocations available within the company, like people resources as well as financial resources as well. But again, if anyone's stuck, I'm happy to help walk them through any of the considerations that they might have for acquiring something like that.
Excellent. Okay. All right, great. Next question here. Russ, this one is good for you. From your perspective, is there any one trend that's more important than the other from an overall impact? And how should engineering teams prepare, or how engineering teams should prepare?
Yeah, that's a good one. So from my perspective, I think it's the need for the BOM, but specifically for inventory of your open source is absolutely critical. As we talked about earlier, you can't secure and comply with the open source you don't know is there. So if you're only going to do one thing, this is, or at least should be, the bare minimum requirement that you're aiming for.
Yeah, and I'd add on top of that, so definitely the BOM, but I definitely think training is critical. It's really hard to hold people accountable that haven't been informed of what's expected of them or been trained to succeed. So at a bare minimum, even if you're doing nothing else, at least training and best practices and understanding of how to avoid obvious legal and security issues by following a process is critical.
Excellent. Okay, I think we have time for one more here, real quick. Here's a good one for you, Alex. What role does data enhanced reporting play in SCA?
So yeah, so data is critical. I mean, the reason you do all this is to get actionable data, right? Nobody does this for fun. This is to get a catalog of everything that you are using so you can manage risk to acceptable levels at your company. So to me, I kind of look at two types of data. If you are the person tasked with producing the bill of material, you need data to help you prioritize and kind of plan what your attack vector is going to be to sift through all the results. So setting policies up front, refining your policies as you evolve and as you go through manual reviews to automate them in the future. Data that will be deemed to be important on how to prioritize items that weren't automatically addressed, what to do about items that are rejected, what to do if a vulnerability pops up, how does your organization handle it, what do you do if there's a license that's not allowed, do you go contact the author, do you negotiate a license, or what do you do, what are your best practices, and trying to be consistent with it. If you're a leader who's consuming the data, right, so let's say you built the bill of material, you're likely interested in two things. You're number one, interested in, are we compliant with our own practices, right? Can I view the bill of material for a given application top down, understand everything that's going in there, understand the provenance, understand where I go to fix an issue. And number two is, if there is an issue, can I search for that in our catalog? Can I understand where I'm impacted, which teams need to make a fix, and can I confirm that the fix has been made? Right, so all of that is ultimately driven with data and insights that an SCA solution should provide.
Awesome. Awesome. All right. Well, we are about 3 minutes to the top of the hour. So unfortunately, that's all the time that we have for question and answer period. I do want to thank everybody who did submit questions. And if we did not get to your question, I apologize. I think we did, but if we didn't, I do apologize. And please know that the folks at Revenera will be getting a copy of all the questions that came through. And I am sure they'll be more than happy to follow up with you offline to get an answer to your question. Also, a quick reminder that today's event has been recorded. So if you missed any or all of the event, or if you just want to watch it again, you'll have the opportunity to do so. Following today's webinar, we will be sending out an email that contains a link to access the webinar on demand. The webinar is also going to be living on the devops.com website, so you can always go look for it there. Just go to devops.com/webinars, look in the on-demand section, and it should be right there waiting for you. All right, I did mention at the top of the hour we would be doing a drawing for 4 $25 Amazon gift cards. So without further ado, let's go ahead and do that. Let's see. Our first winner today is Cameron M. Congratulations, Cameron. Our second winner today is Johnny W. Congratulations, Johnny. Third winner today is Suzanne F. Congratulations, Suzanne. And our fourth and final winner today is Chris G. Congratulations, Chris. We'll be following up with all 4 of you via email to get your Amazon gift card over to you. So please check your inbox. If you don't see anything in your inbox, please check your spam folder. All right, Russ, Alex, thank you so much for a great presentation. Lots of actionable information in that webinar, very insightful, and it's definitely stuff that I know I'll be using throughout the year. So thanks again for your time and your expertise. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Charlene.
And do look for us to come back in Q4 to kind of follow up on what actually happened in 21.
Right on. All right, I'm excited to hear about that. And I will mark my calendar accordingly. All right, I also want to thank the audience for joining me today. This is Charlene O'Hanlon, and I'm signing off. Have a great day, everybody, and please stay safe.